The early decades of the 20th century were filled with the hum of machines and the steady rhythm of assembly lines. Picture a vast factory floor in the heart of an industrial city. The air smells of oil and iron, while the sound of clattering gears and pressing steel fills every corner. Men and women stand side by side at their stations, their movements practiced and precise, shaping the tools of daily life. In these places, typewriters emerge piece by piece, their keys shining under the dim light, while sewing machines and other instruments of comfort are prepared for homes and offices. These factories, filled with sweat and determination, became the silent architects of modern convenience. To an observer of the time, the factory was a symbol of peace and progress. Its products were not weapons, but objects that brought efficiency to work and comfort to domestic life. A typewriter could change the speed of communication in an office, just as a sewing machine could alter the rhythm of a household. Each product carried with it a sense of optimism, a belief that industry served the everyday person. For the workers, there was pride in what their hands created. They were not just laborers, they were craftsmen shaping the modern world. The cities that housed these factories thrived with energy. Streets outside bustled with carts, bicycles, and early automobiles, while smokestacks towered above, announcing the vitality of industry. In the neighborhoods nearby, children grew up with the steady presence of the factory whistle, marking the rhythm of their days. The factory was not only an employer but a community anchor, its influence touching every life within reach. It gave stability in an uncertain age, where the promise of steady wages meant food on the table and shoes on a child's feet. This world of industry was ordinary, yet deeply significant. But beneath the surface of this ordinary world, history was moving toward a darker horizon. Global tensions simmered in the background, like a storm cloud gathering strength. Nations competed for power and influence, their governments watching industry with a new and calculating eye. While workers saw factories as places of livelihood, leaders began to see something else, a vast potential for war. The same machines that pressed typewriter keys or sewed delicate fabrics could be retooled to build weapons. The skills that once served the office and the home could serve the battlefield. This looming possibility remained hidden from daily life. Most workers could not imagine their factory serving anything but the ordinary demands of peace. The clang of hammers and hiss of steam was familiar, almost comforting, and there was no reason to think of bombs or tanks. Yet history was turning, and the factory stood unknowingly at the edge of transformation. They were like actors waiting backstage, unaware of the dramatic role they would soon be forced to play. The ordinary world of typewriters and sewing machines was on the verge of becoming something extraordinary. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, the world outside these factories grew unstable. Political crises and the rise of aggression across continents made war no longer a distant rumor, but a near certainty. The connection between industry and conflict, once faint, became impossible to ignore. Governments prepared, economies shifted, and factories that had once defined modern life would soon define survival. The hum of peacetime production was destined to change into the roar of wartime urgency. The workers did not yet know it, but their skills would soon be called upon to serve a very different world. Imagine walking into such a factory at the dawn of this new era. The smell of oil and metal would still hang in the air. The machines would still rumble in their steady rhythm, but the sense of purpose would be shifting. What once brought joy to a home or efficiency to an office would now bring destruction to a battlefield. The typewriter and the bomb, the sewing machine and the tank, would be bound together by the same assembly lines. This was the hidden truth of the early context, the moment before ordinary factories became the unexpected forges of war. The transformation from peace to war did not arrive quietly. It came as a jarring shock, tearing apart the expectations of ordinary workers and reshaping the purpose of entire industries. Factories that had spent decades perfecting the art of precision in typewriter keys and sewing machine parts suddenly found their blueprints replaced with designs for bombs and tank components. The contrast was dramatic. Where once a worker's skill produced objects meant for communication or comfort, it now produced tools of destruction. The familiar sound of the typewriter's crisp click was replaced by the grinding of heavy metal. Destined for battlefields far away, to the men and women on the factory floor, the change was not only mechanical, but emotional. Imagine a seamstress, once proud of sewing machines that would find their way into homes, now standing beside machinery, shaping parts of artillery. Her movements were the same, the rhythm of her labor unchanged, yet the meaning behind her work was entirely different. What once carried the promise of progress now carried the weight of violence. The sense of pride that came from building something useful for ordinary people gave way to a quieter, more conflicted sense of duty. The factory itself became a place of tension, a place where two worlds collided. The shock of this shift reverberated beyond the walls of industry. Families that had relied on steady access to civilian goods saw them disappear from shelves. Typewriters, once a growing symbol of modern offices, were suddenly scarce. Sewing machines, which had become essential to homes across cities and villages, were harder to find. In their place came an endless production of weapons and machines of war. The comforts of daily life seemed to vanish, consumed by the hunger of the battlefield. The balance between the ordinary and the destructive tipped heavily in favor of survival. The workers themselves lived this contrast every day. They walked to the same buildings, passed through the same doors, and stood at the same stations. Yet what they created no longer belonged to them or their communities. Instead, their work was shipped to distant fronts, carried in crates across oceans, or loaded onto trucks bound for armies. The sense of ownership over their craft was replaced by a sense of distance. The products of their labor would never be seen in their homes, never touched by their children, but would instead explode on foreign soil or roll across shattered landscapes. This abrupt collision of two realities also created a deep sense of unease. On the one hand, there was pride in serving the nation, in knowing that their work sustained soldiers fighting abroad. On the other hand, there was the painful awareness that the same hands which had once built the tools of daily life were now crafting the instruments of destruction. For some, this was a burden carried silently, while for others it became a source of quiet resilience. They accepted that their world had changed, even if they did not fully agree with it. The factory became both a symbol of survival and a reminder of loss. The contrast between peace and war was not abstract. It was personal. Imagine hearing the familiar whistle that once signaled the start of another ordinary workday. Now, it carried a different meaning. It was no longer the call to build tools of convenience, but the signal to begin another day, creating weapons for a war that seemed endless. The walls of the factory, once filled with the rhythm of ordinary life, now echoed with the urgency of conflict. This contrast defined not only the factories, but also the people who worked within them. It was the collision of the familiar and the unthinkable, captured in every bolt, plate, and shell that rolled off the assembly line. The roots of this transformation were not found in sudden invention, but in the quiet adaptability of industry itself. Long before the outbreak of global conflict, factories had already proven their ability to mass produce with extraordinary speed and precision. Assembly lines designed for typewriters, sewing machines, or bicycles were marvels of efficiency. Governments and military planners recognized this hidden potential. What seemed like ordinary tools of daily life were, in fact, products of an industrial system that could be bent and reshaped to serve an entirely different purpose. Industry was never static. It was flexible, and in that flexibility lay the seeds of wartime change. The decision to redirect factories did not emerge overnight. It was born from years of careful observation and preparation. As nations grew uneasy in the face of rising aggression and instability, leaders understood that wars were no longer fought by soldiers alone. Wars were fought by entire societies, with industry serving as the lifeblood of military strength. A typewriter plant could, with minimal adjustments, be reconfigured to produce small metal parts for weapons. A sewing machine factory, with its knowledge of precision mechanics, could adapt to building components for vehicles. This adaptability was not an accident. It was the very nature of modern manufacturing. Workers themselves, though unaware of the full scope, carried the skills that made this shift possible. Their ability to handle small parts, to maintain consistency in production, and to meet demanding quotas became the very qualities that allowed wartime production to flourish. The labor that once brought efficiency to homes and offices could be redirected to serve armies abroad. For governments, this was not just convenient, it was essential. Every bolt tightened, every lever tested, every machine calibrated in a time of peace could be turned toward the needs of war. The transition, though startling, followed a logic rooted in the capabilities of industry itself. The origins of this shift also reflected a deeper truth about technology. In peace, invention serves the comforts of daily life. In war, those same inventions are repurposed for survival. The typewriter, for instance, was a tool of communication, yet its production lines could just as easily create casings for ammunition. The sewing machine was a domestic necessity, yet its precision mirrored the precision required for mechanical parts in vehicles. The boundary between civilian and military use was far thinner than it appeared. What seemed harmless in one context became deadly in another, all depending on the needs of the moment. Imagine the experience of a factory manager standing in front of his workers, explaining that the products they had built for years would no longer be made. Instead, new orders would arrive, requiring different materials, different blueprints, and a new sense of urgency. The men and women listening might have felt confusion, even disbelief. How could a place known for shaping typewriters or sewing machines suddenly be tasked with producing weapons? Yet the machinery was adaptable, and so were the workers. The change was not a question of possibility, but of necessity. The world outside demanded it, and the factory floor obeyed. The deeper origins of this transformation also highlight a recurring theme in history. Human invention is never neutral. It can be bent toward comfort or toward destruction. The same ingenuity that creates tools of progress can also fuel the engines of war. This was the lesson learned as factories shifted from peace to conflict. They were not abandoned or destroyed, they were repurposed. Their legacy was not erased, it was rewritten. The very foundations of modern life, built on the efficiency of industry, became the foundations of survival in a world at war. What began as the story of typewriters and sewing machines was, in truth, the story of industry itself. The origins of wartime production were hidden in plain sight, in the ordinary factories that defined modern life. They did not need to be reinvented, only redirected. The workers and machines were already in place, waiting for the signal that would change everything. And when that signal came, the shift was swift, absolute, and inescapable. This was the hidden beginning of a story that would reshape both the battlefield and the home front in ways no one could have fully anticipated. The transformation of ordinary factories into wartime production centers had consequences that reached far beyond their walls. What began as a shift in blueprints and assembly lines soon revealed itself in the brutal reality of the battlefield. The bombs, tanks, and weapons forged in these repurposed plants became the lifeblood of armies fighting across continents. Without the steady stream of supplies from these factories, campaigns would have faltered and battles might have been lost. The link between the quiet rhythm of the factory floor and the chaos of the front lines became undeniable. Imagine a soldier crouching in a trench, mud soaking through his boots, the air filled with smoke and fear. In his hands he holds a weapon assembled thousands of miles away in a factory that once built typewriters. He may not know the story of that factory nor the workers who shaped the parts he now relies upon, but their work is his survival. Every shot he fires is a silent echo of their labor. The transformation of industry from peace to war was not abstract. It was written in every clash of steel, every burst of artillery, and every moment when a soldier's life depended on the reliability of his weapon. The battlefield itself began to mirror the principles of the factory. Efficiency, precision, and repetition, once reserved for offices and homes, became essential to combat. Armies depended not only on strategy but on a constant flow of replacement parts, ammunition, and vehicles. Just as a factory could not pause its assembly line, an army could not pause its advance without risking defeat. The momentum of war was tied directly to the momentum of industry. The frontline soldier and the factory worker became partners in survival, even if they never met. Tanks rumbling across ruined landscapes were the most visible expression of this connection. Each piece of armor, each turning gear, each shell loaded into its cannon had its origin in an assembly line that once made products of peace. A typewriter factory might have built its casing, a sewing machine plant its gears, a mechanical workshop its firing mechanism. On the battlefield, these machines of destruction carried within them the fingerprints of civilian labor. The soldier who climbed into a tank was, in essence, stepping into the product of 1,000 anonymous hands working under fluorescent lights and the smell of oil. The psychological impact of this connection was profound. Soldiers wrote letters home describing their weapons, their vehicles, and their trust in the supplies sent to them. Families, in turn, recognized that their own labor was woven into the survival of loved ones far away. A mother might sew uniforms in a repurposed textile plant, while her son carried a rifle built in a converted typewriter factory. War no longer existed only on distant battlefields. It existed in the shared rhythm of factory shifts and battlefield maneuvers. Every product of industry carried with it a piece of the society that built it. To the soldiers themselves, the reliability of these weapons meant everything. Imagine being pinned down by enemy fire, your only hope resting on whether your rifle would fire or your tank would advance. The difference between life and death often came down to the precision of workers who had never seen a battlefield. Their unseen efforts gave soldiers confidence, a fragile but vital assurance that they were not alone. Industry had become their silent ally, fighting beside them in the only way it could. This impact on the battlefield redefined the meaning of victory. It was no longer determined solely by the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders. It was also measured in the efficiency of assembly lines and the endurance of workers at home. The clash of armies was, in truth, the clash of industries, each side racing to outproduce the other. The weapons of war bore the unmistakable imprint of factories that had once served peace. And as the battles raged on, the story of these surprising factories was written in blood, steel, and the unyielding rhythm of war. The transformation of factories from civilian to military production had consequences that stretched far beyond the battlefield. Ordinary families began to feel the impact as familiar goods disappeared from store shelves. Typewriters, once symbols of modern efficiency in offices, became scarce. Sewing machines, long cherished as household necessities, were no longer available in abundance. Their place was taken by the relentless output of weapons, ammunition, and vehicles. For many civilians, this meant learning to live without the conveniences that had defined daily life. While adjusting to a world where the war reached into every home, the sense of loss was not limited to material goods. It touched the very fabric of daily existence. Families who had once gathered around the steady sound of a sewing machine now faced silence, replaced only by the distant knowledge that the same factory was producing tools of destruction. Workers who once took pride in seeing their products in shops or homes now carried a different burden. Their labor was vital, yet its results were invisible in everyday life, sent instead to distant battlefields. This shift blurred the boundaries between civilian and military life, binding both worlds together in the struggle for survival. The consequences also reshaped the rhythms of work itself. Factory shifts lengthened, demands grew harsher, and the urgency of war dictated every schedule. Men and women were expected to produce not just quickly, but relentlessly. The whistle that once marked the beginning of an ordinary day now carried the weight of national expectation. Every mistake, every delay, every moment lost could mean shortages at the front. The factory became a place where pressure was constant, where the needs of soldiers thousands of miles away were felt in every movement of a worker's hand. In this new reality, society itself became part of the war effort. The home front was no longer a place of distance from conflict, but an extension of the battlefield. Workers in industrial cities were told that their labor was as important as the courage of soldiers. Propaganda reinforced this idea, urging men and women to see their shifts not as ordinary jobs, but as acts of service. To many, this brought a sense of pride, but it also carried exhaustion and sacrifice. Ordinary lives were reshaped, and every community became tied to the fortunes of war. The emotional consequences were equally significant. Imagine a worker leaving the factory after a long shift, hands covered in grease and mind heavy with fatigue. Instead of carrying home the satisfaction of building something familiar, he carried the knowledge that his labor would be used in destruction. Some found pride in this duty, believing it was necessary for survival. Others felt unease, knowing the same skills that once brought progress were now fueling devastation. This emotional weight became part of the unspoken cost of war, carried by millions who never set foot on a battlefield. Children, too, felt the difference. They grew up in a world where toys and clothes were scarce, where parents worked longer hours, and where the conversations at home were filled with the language of production and sacrifice. The innocence of civilian life was shadowed by the urgency of war. Factories that had once represented stability now symbolized struggle. The wider consequences of industrial transformation were not confined to soldiers or leaders. They were lived by entire societies, reshaping daily life in ways that could never fully return to what they had been before. The blurring of lines between peace and conflict became one of the defining features of this era. War was not fought only on the front lines, but in every factory, every household, and every community that adjusted to the demands of survival. The wider consequences revealed a truth both powerful and unsettling, that modern war consumed not only armies, but entire nations. In this sense, the factories that once built typewriters and sewing machines had become more than workplaces. They were symbols of sacrifice, resilience, and the inescapable reach of conflict into the heart of ordinary life. The climax of this transformation came when the demands of war reached their absolute peak. Factories that once produced steady streams of household goods were now operating at a pace never imagined in peacetime. Assembly lines ran day and night with little pause between shifts, their machines roaring under the strain of constant motion. The scale of production was staggering. Where typewriters and sewing machines had once rolled off the line by the hundreds, bombs, rifles, and tanks now emerged by the thousands. The ordinary identity of these factories was completely eclipsed by their wartime role. They were no longer places of convenience and progress, but engines of survival. For workers, the intensity of this moment was overwhelming. Imagine stepping into a factory lit by harsh fluorescent lights, the air thick with heat, and the smell of oil. Every station is occupied, every hand moving with urgency, every sound echoing with the rhythm of war. The pressure was relentless. Mistakes were unforgivable, delays intolerable. Supervisors pushed their teams harder than ever before, and the workers themselves carried the weight of knowing that the fate of soldiers, perhaps even the outcome of battles, depended on their precision and speed. This was not simply labor. It was survival turned into routine. The factories had become extensions of the battlefield itself. Each completed rifle or tank was a weapon already counted upon by soldiers at the front. Each crate of ammunition was a lifeline to men dug into trenches or advancing across shattered landscapes. The connection between the worker and the soldier was now absolute, though invisible. A misaligned part could cost a soldier his life. A tank delayed in production could mean defeat in a crucial battle. The stakes of every movement on the assembly line were magnified to their greatest possible extent. Ordinary tasks became extraordinary responsibilities. This moment of climax also revealed the cost of such transformation. Workers were exhausted, their bodies strained by endless shifts, their minds dulled by repetition and urgency. Families felt the absence of parents who worked through the night. Children missed the presence of fathers and mothers who returned home only to sleep before another shift began. The promise of stability once offered by factory life had vanished, replaced by sacrifice that consumed every aspect of daily existence. The machines themselves bore scars of overuse, breaking down under the weight of demands, only to be repaired and pressed back into service without rest. The factories in this peak moment seemed almost alive. The clanging of hammers, the grinding of gears, the hiss of steam created a constant symphony of urgency. The air was hot, thick with dust and smoke, every corner illuminated by sparks from welding torches. Workers could barely hear themselves think, yet they moved with mechanical determination, knowing that time was the enemy as much as the opposing armies. To step into such a place was to feel the heartbeat of war, pulsing not at the front lines, but in the relentless churn of industry. At this height of transformation, the difference between past and present became undeniable. A factory once known for the steady production of typewriters was now celebrated for its output of rifles. A plant that had built sewing machines was now measured by the number of tanks rolling off its floor. The memory of civilian production seemed distant, almost forgotten, as if buried under the urgency of the moment. Industry itself had been remade into a weapon. Its old identity had been erased by necessity, replaced by a singular focus on victory. The climax of this story was both awe-inspiring and sobering. It revealed the power of human adaptability, the capacity to redirect entire societies toward survival. Yet, it also revealed the fragility of peace, how quickly the tools of daily life could be transformed into instruments of war. The factories, once ordinary, had become extraordinary in their purpose. At their peak, they stood as symbols of both strength and sacrifice, embodying the very heart of a world consumed by conflict. This was the moment when the transformation of industry could no longer be denied, a moment when the machines of peace had been completely overtaken by the machines of war. When the guns finally fell silent and the last tanks rolled back from battle, the factories faced the monumental task of change once again. The war had ended, but the machinery of industry could not simply stop. Workers returned to their stations, and the familiar rhythm of the assembly line began to slow, shift, and redirect. Blueprints for bombs were set aside, and the machines that had once shaped tank armor returned to stamping the frames of typewriters and sewing machines. Yet nothing was the same as before. The memory of what had been built and the sacrifices made lingered in every corner of the factory floor. The return to civilian production was not without difficulty. Many workers carried the fatigue of years spent under relentless pressure. Families tried to rebuild lives that had been defined by absence and sacrifice. The goods that returned to shelves, sewing machines, typewriters, and other instruments of daily life, were welcomed with relief, yet they carried a different weight now. They were no longer just objects of convenience. They were symbols of resilience, of the ability to endure hardship and return to normalcy. Every key pressed on a new typewriter, every stitch made with a new sewing machine, was a quiet reminder of what industry had endured and overcome. The legacy of these surprising factories was more than economic. It was cultural and emotional. Workers who had once crafted the tools of destruction now returned to building the tools of peace, yet their knowledge had been forever shaped by wartime necessity. Techniques learned under pressure carried over into peacetime production. Efficiency, precision, and innovation, qualities sharpened by war, remained in the DNA of post-war industry. Civilian goods became cheaper, faster to produce, and more reliable. The world that emerged from the conflict carried with it the shadow of war, even in the ordinary objects that filled homes and offices. For many, this legacy was bittersweet. Imagine a worker placing the finishing touches on a typewriter, the clatter of its keys echoing softly in the factory. To outsiders, it was just another machine, another tool for an office. But for the worker, it carried the memory of years spent building weapons instead of instruments of communication. The satisfaction of creation was now tied inseparably to the memory of destruction. Factories had proven that industry could serve both peace and war, and this dual nature left a mark that could not be erased. The story of these factories also reshaped how nations understood industry itself. Never again would manufacturing be seen as purely civilian. The war had shown that every factory, no matter how ordinary, held the potential to become a weapon of survival. Governments, workers, and societies as a whole carried this awareness into the future. The sewing machine and the bomb, the typewriter and the rifle were forever linked in memory. They represented the two faces of human invention, capable of creating comfort and devastation with equal skill. As years passed, the echoes of wartime industry faded but never fully disappeared. The factories continued to produce, their machines humming once again with the rhythms of peace. Yet history remembered their transformation. They had been the hidden battlegrounds of the war, where ordinary labor turned into extraordinary effort. Their story became a reminder of how deeply war reshapes societies, not only through the clash of armies, but through the quiet persistence of workers far from the front. It was a legacy of resilience, sacrifice, and the unsettling closeness between progress and destruction. The surprising factories that once built bombs, tanks, and typewriters together remain a testament to the adaptability of human society. They show us how ordinary places can become central to extraordinary struggles, how invention can both protect and destroy, and how peace and war are never as far apart as they may seem. Their legacy is not only in the machines they produced, but in the lessons they left behind, that history is written not only by generals and soldiers, but by the hands of countless workers whose craft, in times of both peace and conflict, shapes the course of the world.